Welcome to Doing Virtue,
a Catholic podcast
where virtue is what we do.
I'm your host, Anthony Criste. I'm joined in the house tonight, as usual, by my co-hosts, Mark, LaRochelle, and Brian Hicks. Before we get into the topic tonight and introduce our special guest of honor, we are going to review a drink, talk about a few significant historical events that have happened in this past week, and a few interesting things before we jump into the topic. So, Mark, why don't we talk about this booze that you brought?
Absolutely. So we have the Macallan 12-year-old double cask. I have been told it is the Macallan because my brother-in-law, when he was in Edinburgh, I think it's Edinburgh. He I guess his family has had like this debate on whether it's called the Macallan or the Macallan, so he was like, I don't really know what it is. And in Edinburgh, you needed to have your passport in order to get alcohol or something like that.
Okay.
If you weren't a local, you needed to have your passport in order to get alcohol. So he went in and he knew he wasn't going to get any alcohol, but he was like, I need somebody to, we have this dispute going on in our family. Is it called this or that? And the lady said it's the Macallan. And then as he was about to leave, he said, what? She was like, hold on. And she brought up like this really, really expensive whiskey and like had him try it.
Nice.
It was just
amazing.
Anyway, just all that's to say.
It wasn't this, though. It was something else.
Yeah, it was something else.
Something
better. But it is the Macallan, not the Macallan. So
awesome.
So why don't you pour it, Anthony, as I give some information. The color of it is the Harvest Sun, which
obviously. What else could it be?
It looks like a Modelo. That's and the aroma is a creamy butterscotch with a hint of toffee apple. It's all one word: toffee apple, candied orange, vanilla custard, and newly felled oak.
Wow.
So poetic.
Boom.
Yeah, I made that up on the spot.
That's really impressive, Mark.
I just tasted it and I
just
knew
like
immediately. And then the palate is deliciously honeyed, ginger and citrus balanced with raisins and caramel. And then the finish is oak lingers, warm, sweet, and drying.
Mark, I think you went to the McInerney School of Whiskey Description. What did he say? He took a sip and said, "This is like simple but precocious," or something like that. And we were all like, "Okay, sure." No, I agree with him.
Just what
exactly.
I was thinking.
No, he goes, yeah, you should just put two words that kind of mean different things, but are kind of like intellectual words, and then that's what it is. There you go. So.
Oh my goodness!
Anything else on that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. The Macallan has 6 pillars by which their whiskey is formed, and they have a little description.
Okay.
From our spiritual home in Speyside, our curiously small stills distill the finest cut before maturation. In exceptional oak casks, these casks deliver the natural color, aromas, and flavors of our peerless spirit. Man, spirit twice.
Why didn't they just make that like one sentence? Why is it 6 pillars?
I think it is.
It's 6 pillars, Anthony.
All right. Okay. Not going to dispute it. To the Scots. Cheers.
Cheers.
That counted. Cheers. All right. So before we get into the topic of the evening, I wanted to talk about a couple of things quickly. First, this past week, on September 8th, we celebrated the birthday of Mary. So that's a pretty big feast day in the church. Also, earlier this week was the anniversary of the Battle of Vienna, which took place on September 12th, 1683. The Ottomans were trying to take over Europe, and they were stopped by the Holy Roman Empire and the Polish. One of the main factors in that battle going favorably towards the Holy Roman Empire was the Polish cavalry, not cavalry. That's where Christ died. Cavalry, named the Winged Hussars. So they were a Polish group of horseback riders. For more information on the Winged Hussars, I would recommend going and listening to the Catholic Man Show. They have an episode on it, and they're such big fans of the Winged Hussars that they actually released their own wine called the Hussar wine. It's a red wine aged in, I think, in bourbon barrels. So it's kind of a cool wine. I don't know if it's still available, but it was a few years ago. So that's kind of an interesting thing. For books about Vienna, Mark bought one book. I'm going to mention two other ones, and before I get further, he's going to read a quote from that book.
Dear.
I'll mention the two books first, though.
Yep.
So one of them is called The Siege of Vienna by John Stoy, and another one is called Enemy at the Gate by Andrew Wheatcroft. And then the book that Mark bought is called...
It's called The Battle of Vienna, 1683, The History and Legacy of the Decisive Conflict Between the Ottoman Turkish Empire and the Holy Roman Empire by Charles River.
Charles River.
That was a
Okay.
mouthful.
Yep. Yep.
I'm intrigued.
While you're pulling up that quote, an interesting picture I saw. If you want to visualize the Winged Hussars, there's a painting called The Hetman Guard by W. Polizek, which I'm assuming is a Polish last name, and I don't know if I said it correctly, but it's a pretty sweet picture of a Polish guard on horseback with the big metal wings coming out. And I heard a story, and I won't get into the details too much, but I think that the wings were dual purpose. The one purpose is because it makes this sound, which would make, when the horse riders are coming over the hill, it makes it more intimidating because it makes more noise than what's actually there. But I also heard that because this is the 1600s, muskets had recently been invented, and they were having problems with the horses getting scared of the muskets. So they created it so it was like virtual white noise. And so the horses would focus on that noise because it was consistent. And then when the guns were going off, it didn't affect them as much.
And also with that, I'm pretty sure it would also make the horses go faster because it actually scared them.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I guess they're being scared by one thing rather than the other. But
Every time a Polish soldier gets his wings, a horse goes faster. I don't know.
I remember
something
that
to
one.
be-
Yeah.
Pretty sure
yeah,
that's
I love that.
Proverbs
I
27.
think
I was
saw
going
a
to say
movie about
Frank
that.
Capra, but yeah. Do you have that quote?
Oh boy, I know it's kind of a dark quote though, but
That's okay.
I love it. So this is the declaration of war from the Sultan Mehmed IV to the Habsburgs. So this is in February, so whatever, eight months before the Battle of Vienna. And he said, "I declare to you, I will make myself your master, pursue you from east to west, to trample upon all that is pleasant and accessible to your eyes. I resolve to ruin you and your people, and to leave your empire a commemoration to my dreadful sword. I will establish my religion and pursue your crucified God, whose wrath I do not fear. I will put your sainted priests to the plow. I will rape your women, forsake your God, your religion, or I will order that you be consumed in fire." So pretty heavy words.
Wow.
So it's pretty awesome that they got destroyed. But yeah.
Dang.
Yeah.
Let's go. Wing has
For more, one other thing before we move on to the next historical event, there's a song called "The Winged Hussars" by a Swedish metal band named Sabaton. Is that how you pronounce it? I think it's Sabaton, which was released in 2016 on their album called "Last Stand." So that's a pretty cool song to look into.
It's legit.
It's pretty legit.
It is.
That victory resulted in the Pope declaring that day in honor of I guess it became Holy Name of Mary, because the Battle of Lepanto became Our Lady of Victory, and then later became Our Lady of the Rosary. So also this week, which happened much later in history, but earlier than September 12th, was on September 11th, which was the 9/11 attacks that happened, where over 3,000 people died. And so a lot more could be said about those things, but I think it's important to think about the the narrative of Islamic terrorism that started all the way back at the Battle of Lepanto and continued through the Battle of Vienna and continued through the 9/11 attacks and is still very much alive today. And there's several good books that I wrote down to look into that more. One of them is called Sword and Scimitar by Raymond Ibram. There's another one called Islam at the Gate by Diane Moskar. And I had one more. Where is it? I'm not sure where. I guess it's down here. A few more, actually. The first one is kind of an overview of Islam. It's called Sword of the Prophet by Sergei Trivkovic. And then if you want to delve into the actual different historical events that involve Islam, there's a book on the Crusades by Thomas Madden, and another one called What Were the Crusades by Jonathan Riley Smith. And then if you want to look at the religion of Islam and Catholicism paired, not just Islam versus the Holy Roman Empire, Islam versus the United States, you can look at it from a different perspective, there's a book called Faith, Reason, and the War Against Jihadism by George Weigel. So I'd recommend all those books. I haven't read all of them, but I've had people recommend them to me, so I assume that they're worth recommending. To quickly go back to the Battle of Vienna, one of the results of the Battle of Vienna was that the Christians came across coffee, and it had been in the Western world, but the Muslims, it seems, were the kind of the original creators, and they became masters of roasting and made it kind of a wholesale item that it wasn't before. So when the Christians defeated the Muslims at the Battle of Vienna, they started drinking the coffee as like partially plunder of war. They take the spoils, but also kind of to put it in their face that we're drinking your drink. And there was something that evolved because of that. Yeah, Brian, do you want to talk about that real quick?
Sure. It's actually the croissant.
Ooh.
So there's actually...
No, that was it.
Yeah. All right, and we're moving on. No, and I'll be super brief, but the legend goes, and I looked it up online, and that's what they call it. They kind of call it a legend. But the legend goes that after the Battle of Vienna and the Turks lost, there were French bakers in Vienna. And so it goes that so on the flag it had a crescent for the Ottomans, and so they made a pastry that made it look like they were eating. They were like, "Haha, we beat you guys."
Just a mockery.
Yeah, pretty much. But so I looked into it a little more. It sounds like it is a legend. First, it started out as cookies, like crescent cookies that were Austrian, but also in Austria, and then. Supposedly, actually, it was later that it ended up becoming what we know as croissants. But I'm not really sure. But again, it didn't even start in France. It actually started in Austria, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah.
And it started from a cookie and then became this amazing thing. But
that's really cool.
That's all.
So one other thing about the Battle of Vienna, I was looking into it a little bit about coffee, and apparently the coffee made it all the way to the Vatican, and the Pope's advisors were really hesitant to actually they were very excited, and they were really pushing to ban it. They were like, "This is like the devil's drink. Like, we don't want anything to do with the Muslims. Like, we need to ban this." So, the Pope wanted to try it.
I don't drink it.
So Pope Clement VIII, he tries it. He gets them to make it for him. He tries it. And he likes it, and so he says, quote, "This is the devil's drink, but it's delicious, so we should cheat the devil and baptize it." So he was like just like, well, this is good, so we should just take it away from them. There's kind of a fuller story on that on a website by the Catholic Gentleman, and they have a blog entitled "Blessed Beans: How the Pope Baptized Coffee." So it gives a little bit more background if anyone's interested in looking into that. Now, lastly, today is the feast of the Exaltation of the Holy Cross, found in the Holy Land by Saint Helena. And then that kind of became sponsored by Constantine, her son. Christendom College has a small piece of the cross, which I believe they put out exposed today for students to venerate. And it's kind of a dual feast for Christendom because it's also the 46th anniversary of Christendom's founding, primarily led by Dr. Warren Carroll. So that's a pretty big day for the campus as well. And if anyone wants to look up pictures of the founders, one of our alumni, Vincent Duig, drew 5 pictures of all of the founders that they posted online. But you can, I think they're in the chapel. I think they're in the chapel, and you can also buy copies or prints of them as well. So that's all I had to say about this week.
Well,
fascinating.
Now we are going to introduce our guest.
It's a pretty good segue into our guest because Christendom. So we have on Dr. Kathleen Sullivan.
Hello.
Hey.
She is an assistant or an associate professor?
Assistant
professor.
Assistant
Sorry.
Yeah, right.
Assistant to the... No, I'm just kidding. Assistant professor of English Language and Literature at Christendom. She got her bachelor's at TAC in California, and then got her master's in English at the University of Dallas. And then
so legitimate. Good.
Eventually her PhD from CUA in English. And now she teaches freshmen and upper levels in literature. And we're having her on to talk about Jane Austen.
That's so exciting. Thanks, guys. I'm really glad to be here.
So we can kind of just, before we get into that, if you want to just, I guess, talk about, I guess, how you got out here to Christendom, but then also, I guess, along the way, I'd imagine that Jane Austen got a pretty big part in your life. So.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I'll go back to where I'm from, which is New Hampshire, and affectionately I call it the Shire. Go home to visit the Shire. And so during high school, kind of looking around and found Thomas Aquinas, and they had a summer program which was just game-changing. I remember going out. It was a 2-week program, and my high school, it's the typical high school. You study, you take the quiz, you take the test, and it's mostly just note-taking in class. So I had never experienced the seminar style of discussion, which is what TAC does. And I was kind of shy in high school, and going out to the program, I didn't say a single word for the entire first week in class. It's a 2-week program. Right now I'm like, blah, 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 chat. But it was just intimidating. And all these other students, they were saying brilliant things. And what can I contribute? And I didn't know what to say. And very much enjoyed the readings, but I just didn't know how to put myself out there in the class discussion. And then one of the evenings, I remember walking back to the Commons and just kind of chatting with one of the summer workers. So he wasn't working the program, he was there working on campus over the summer. And, how's the summer program going for you? I'm like, oh, fine. What do you enjoy about it? Oh, I don't know. Everything. And then he's like, well, tell me something you really do enjoy. It doesn't have to be about the program. And I was like, my family. And he's like, great. So what's so wonderful about your family? I was like, well, I love them. They love me. And he's like, all right, well, so what do you think it is about love that makes this something? And I didn't even realize it, but now reflecting back, I was like, ooh, he did the Socratic discussion very well. And I just remember had this great conversation, and other students came by and joined in and talked about the nature of family and friendship and love. And I distinctly remember going back to the dorm that evening and saying to myself, I have to come here. Mm-hmm. And it just lit a fire in me in a way that I just hadn't experienced in my education before, of, wow, first of all, I am responsible. Like I can put in my own thoughts and ask questions and try to get to the understanding of the why we are drawn to certain things. What are the good things in life? And yeah, I was just really inspired. And the next week I spoke up in class and it was just an experience that showed me how valuable. I remember going to see the two towers, and I'm watching the scene where I'm forgetting the king's name, but his son is brought back, Eowyn's brother.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
What's his name?
Theodred.
Yes, thank you. And he's weeping at the funeral, and I remember, again, having this moment in the movie theater, like, am I experiencing catharsis right now? Should I pity him? Am I moved by this? Why am I moved by this? And I also then had the subsequent thought, oh no, is this going to be my life forever? That I'm constantly questioning and seeking to know the nature of why I'm experiencing a certain reaction or things like that. So anyway, moving on from TAC, the program there is liberal arts, and it's a set curriculum. And so we do obviously read some literature. And we read Jane Austen. We actually read Emma. And I obviously grew up loving literature and always wanted to talk more about it. So after TAC, I was thinking, okay, where do I see myself going next? And applied to graduate programs in literature. And it was just, again, the kind of eye-opening to be able to now go in such depth in a particular field that I greatly enjoyed. Because there aren't majors at TAC other than the liberal arts. You're graduating in liberal arts. So went to UD. That was great. And then in between UD and Catholic University, so in between my master's and my doctorate, I worked for a school. I taught for a year in Maryland. I taught at a grammar school. Just 6th and 7th grade religion. Just kind of a job in between that transition while I was finishing my master's thesis. And that was fun. Also very growing. I encourage anybody who's like wants to grow in discipline and whatnot, go teach at a grammar school. You'll greatly learn your strengths and you'll greatly learn your weaknesses. But it was overall just super joyful. So I had the 6th and 7th graders for religion. And again, still things like come back in my memory and I chuckle. And I'll remember this one quiz I had given them on Noah's Ark. We were working our way through some of the key Bible stories. And I had asked a question on a quiz, like, what did Noah do after the dove came back and they landed? And the proper answer was he offered a sacrifice to God, right? My student wrote as the response, Noah sacrificed all the animals. Okay, let's go back to the story. Anyway, so things like that. It was just joyful, very, like I said, again, very much a growing time. And then I applied to graduate schools, and then from there went on to Catholic University. And that was really amazing because since I already had my master's, I could teach immediately. Right. So while I was getting classes and working on my finishing my PhD, I was also teaching at Catholic U. So they had, the regular 101 introductory literature courses, English courses. But one of my favorite ones was I was able to teach a course called The Literature of Fantasy. So we read actually Midsummer Night's Dream, and then a Narnia book, and oh gosh, I'm forgetting the others, but I'll always remember I had a student who he came up to me after the first day and he said, I'm a politics major, but I had to fulfill a literature requirement, so I have to take your class, but I have to let you know I'm not a fan of reading non-important books.
Wow.
I read political books and biographies. I was like, okay, well, you know the requirements. You've got to read all the books here. And he wasn't super invested in the class, but I do remember when we were going through the Narnia book, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, because there's that scene when Eustace has been turned into a dragon because of his greediness, and he's in pain, and Aslan comes, and Aslan has him bathe in the waters, and then Aslan like tears off the dragon skin, and it's so painful. And I remember reading that out loud in class, and we were discussing kind of the baptismal, significance there. And the student was alert and invested, and he was asking questions, and I was just like thinking internally, like, okay, God, at least, he's seeing the value that literature isn't just entertainment and it doesn't actually serve a deeper spiritual purpose. So he had very distinct handwriting, and usually at the end of the course, you don't get your teacher evaluations until the next semester. And by then I'm like, I don't know who any of these students are. You can't tell the handwriting, but his handwriting was very distinct. And, I saw it and I was like, oh dear, what is he going to say about this course of unimportant books? And he wrote, this was a good class. It had way too much reading. And he wrote, I think Miss Sullivan was the first truly Catholic teacher I had at the school.
Whoa.
I know.
That's you.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, and as a senior, yeah.
A senior.
Yeah. Anyways, I mean, Catholic U was great. I don't want to. Yeah, but I think it was probably he hadn't experienced approaching literature through the light of Christ, and I always tried to do that when we're talking about. Obviously you approach the work. It's an intellectual object. You're approaching it. Let's see how it is as a work of art, and then. Well, okay, what else is there? Like what true, good, beautiful thing perhaps that God is trying to reveal to us through this work of art. So, yeah, anyway, I'm just grateful that he was able to find some good from
Yeah.
that.
No, truly.
Do you think
Yeah.
that Catholics are guilty of reading into
Yeah.
literature
Yeah.
too much, or maybe like sidestepping the obvious like Catholic hint that's there, but going way deeper and being like, okay, well, clearly this is like an analogy about baptism, and you're like, well, is there evidence of that? Like, was the writer Catholic?
Right.
Does that even add up with what's going on?
Yes. No, that's such a good question. I think there is a tendency for us to, maybe miss the fact that this is a work of art and it exists there for us to examine intellectually and just search for Catholic symbols and kind of impose on it. But yeah, if the reading lends to that type of an understanding, so we always just talk about what do we know by nature. And by nature, water can cleanse and it can nourish and it can refresh. And okay, well then what do we see by this tearing away of a dragon skin? So the nature of a dragon, just traditionally, not that, we're observing dragons every day, but just through historical literary tradition, dragons are fearsome terrors and they're hoarders of treasure. Anyway, so I kind of operate on that level of what do we know just based on our observation of the evidence in the text. And then if a deeper, more spiritual reading is present, then we'll unpack that. And usually great works of literature will have that layer of spiritual truth.
Before we get into how you
Yeah.
ended up at Christendom,
Yeah.
just while we're on the topic of dragons, do you think that something I've heard Jordan Peterson say and a couple of other like Catholic, not that Jordan Peterson is Catholic, but other separately Catholic speakers say, is that we don't have enough stories with dragons in them anymore, and that we kind of like, I think we we approach evil in a very careful way, and we kind of step around it, or we say, like recently Disney has been doing this thing where they'll be making movies about how the villain actually had a really rough childhood.
Totally.
And so their actions may be justified, or yes, they're acting out. It wasn't good that they killed that person, but also they were abused.
You
and
can't
it's
blame
like,
them, yeah.
But right, you
Yeah.
can't blame them, and it's a very like victim centered. Do you think that society, and maybe particularly men, would benefit from fairy tales more if good and evil was portrayed in a much more, there's a dragon, he's evil, and we need to defeat him, and this is a good thing to save the town or save the girl or whatever? Is that something that you think is missing from society, and something that we
Yes.
should try to somehow like return to?
Yes, no, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly when historically that shift of, defending the evil or showing, well, we can excuse, and if we understand what's going on, then we'll excuse the evil. And then all of a sudden today, we're obviously celebrating the evil and not even calling it evil. So there's a huge value to going back to those traditional fairy tales where the clarity is right there. Good, evil, good will vanquish evil. And so I always think I love Ratatouille. The music is great, but I have a problem, like probably the most repulsive thing to find in your kitchen is a rat. And now we're like,
But he's a good
I
cook.
know he's a great cook. I'm like, I want the rat in my kitchen. And so that's the type of thing where you're just like, I see what you're doing.
Do you think that's an
That's really
attempt to make something that's normally like gross and icky
Uh-huh.
good, or do you think that that's a way to just, I don't know, like creatively tell a story? Because I don't think that they're, other than rats in real life being like carriers of disease and gross, there's nothing particularly like evil about. I mean, I guess rats in literature are shown as evil, but usually it's like snakes and dragons and like wolves and spiders and things like that are shown as evil. So do you think that that's kind of a direct trying to change the narrative of saying that rats are good, or do you think that that's just Disney or like kind of just animation studios ways of kind of just making you sympathize with whatever they feel like?
Yeah,
You know?
maybe a little bit of both there, but because there's definitely a benefit Say your kid is terrified of dogs, and like, well, let's read the Pokey Little Puppy story, and look, I don't know, maybe it can reframe something that shouldn't be feared in a way that you can find sympathy with. But yeah, I think probably maybe subtly behind the scenes, maybe not so behind the scenes anymore, there are those attempts to actually take something which we shouldn't welcome into our lives or our thoughts or imaginations and portray it in a way that now we're more receptive to it. So I think that's where the danger can come, and where literature is so powerful, because good literature, good art should engage the imagination. We talk about this a lot in class of, obviously you want to know the good so you can pursue it. But how do you get someone to desire and actually pursue the good? Well, we're imitative beings. Like, let's portray a story where you're inspired by some character who is going out there saving the world, slaying the dragons, etc. And you're like, I want to be like that. So I was reading this critic who was saying, children aren't asking, how do I be good, or what's the way in which I be good, but they ask, how do I become like so and so? How do I become like Peter, Susan, Lucy, and Edmund, for example? So giving them a concrete image, then they can, I'm quoting this critic and I forget his name, but they can try on, he calls it a wardrobe of images, a wardrobe of your imagination. So you try on that knightly suit of armor, or you try on, whatever it might be. And you're like, yes, I can visualize myself in this because I've lived through it through the story. And then you're going from knowing what's good to now desiring it. You want those traits too.
Right.
Yeah.
So with fairy tales, one of the things that I've found is, or fairy tales, but then also just like great literature. And
yes.
Especially being at Christendom, so many people are well read, and they've had it also through their childhood and everything. But also when we get older, there is kind of a part of us that kind of, whether we want to or not, kind of loses that innocence to be able to like sit down and read a fairy tale.
Yes.
Is there, I guess I'm kind of talking, or I'm kind of asking because I almost find like, I'm asking almost from a personal standpoint.
You go for it. Why not?
Because I would say I like reading and I want to read, but there is a lot of fairy tales, like the Grimm fairy tales, and there are a lot of just the Hans Andersen fairy tales that I've never read. But do you think, I guess, extrapolating to a general, if people are they're not exposed to that when they're younger, should they read these things and then kind of go up from there? Or is it like, oh, we can read Jane Austen and we can almost find the same thing? Or like, yeah, I guess.
No, that's a great question. So actually, I have a book. It's mostly book lists, but it's called Before Austen Came Aesop. So before you read Jane Austen, go read Aesop's Fables, read the fairy tales. And his point was, and I'll get to your point too. So yes,
Sure.
Go back and read the fairy tales. So short answer, but more in the sense of when you are reading those fairy tales, you're kind of getting used to that imaginative living and that kind of vicarious living in the story. And then, if you've been used to, for example, so I'm also currently teaching a course on children's literature at Christendom, and we're in the midst of The Wind in the Willows. And if you've read it, Kenneth Grahame is so poetic. I mean, he has sentences that are half a page long, and it's so descriptive, and all these beautiful subordinating clauses and prepositional phrases, and I love it. And I remember reading somebody who was commenting on Kenneth Grahame, like, if you've fed your child, so to speak, The Wind in the Willows when he's young, he'll be more apt to seek Charles Dickens or Dostoevsky even, or even Tolkien, who's super descriptive as well. But yeah, so even if you didn't grow up on the fairy tales and the traditional stories, go back now, I will quote C.S. Lewis, someday you will be old enough to read fairy tales again. And that, I think, can resonate so much because we have so much more experience to bring into the fairy tale or the children's book, that we are, through our memories, perhaps, of what we've experienced when we've battled, our various dragon, through that memory, then we are refreshed and restored. So for my students reading The Wind in the Willows, there's this beautiful chapter called The Sweetness of Home. I won't say it in Latin, although Kenneth Graham entitles in Latin. What is it? It's like Dulce Domum or something. And a lot of my students currently are seniors, and they were just saying while reading that as a senior, it's Ratty and Mole had gone to visit their friend the badger in the woods in the winter, and they're heading back, and Mole, it's characterized as he feels this electric shock to him, and he realizes that he's passing by his home, which he hasn't been to in a while because he's been living on the riverbank, and they've been having a wonderful summer, and in the winter they're spending time with their other friend in the woods, and so he hasn't been to his home in a while. And just when he passes by the path in the woods, it's characterized as this calling out of like, come back and return, and it's beautifully portrayed. And he goes back and tells his friend, like, we have to go back, and anyways, it's so moving. So thinking about that element, as you're reading it as an adult, you're older, and you think about, gosh, like sometimes I do feel that longing for home, like that nostalgia to go back to home, which you obviously can't ever go back to the past. So what it can do is that it can remind you of what's the next home that I long for? Right. So that nostalgic longing for something of childhood that you're reading as an adult through a children's book can actually be this prayer of now transitioning of, oh, okay, what I'm truly longing for is the home, like the eternal home. And so, yeah, so that type of experience that you can gain through reading a kid's book, I think is of such value. I don't know, sometimes I even feel like, gosh, is this academic enough? We're reading Alice in Wonderland and The Wizard of Oz in college. Like, is this allowed? Are other people going to be like, oh, you're reading children's books? Well, I'm reading Kant and Nietzsche. I don't know. And so some of my students, too, they're just like, I was, one of the girls, just like all of her other suite mates were busily working on, some very intellectually challenging work. She's like, well, I'm off to read The Wizard of Oz. Oh, like what work I have ahead of me. And
off to read The Wizard.
Hey, well done. But then another student just recently said she's so glad she's required to read these stories because she hadn't.
Right.
Growing up, and because our time is so limited and we have so many interests, if you have a couple of hours on a afternoon, are you going to go and pick up Alice in Wonderland? Probably not. Are you going to go pick up Hans Christian? Probably not. So she said, like, this has been a great benefit to be in a stage where I have to read this, and now kind of seeing the beauty and the joy within. Also realism too, for as much as there's death, violence, separation, loss, abandonment in all these stories, but the key element of a fairy tale and the key element of a children's story, the traditional fairy tales at least, there is a happy ending.
Right.
You just, no matter how dark the woods are, no matter how crazy the cyclone is, you're going to get back home.
Right.
So there's a assured walking forward through the unknown in these stories because you are confident it's going to end well.
I don't know. Well, no, one of the things I find, or that what you just said that I definitely kind of agree with, is I'm glad there are books that we are required. Like we
Yeah.
have 4 classes of required reading for literature that I'm so grateful for, because I wouldn't have read or even tried to have read like
The
things
Bible,
like
The catechism.
Yeah,
It's
well,
just
all right.
That
Yeah.
the Summa.
Can I
Yeah,
just
exactly.
say, Christ taught in parables.
This is true.
So,
no, truly.
yeah, but yeah.
But having the student, or just having myself being able to be just
Yeah.
Almost like justified in reading something that you
Right.
wouldn't otherwise.
Right.
You don't
Yes.
feel like you're
Right.
wasting your time.
yeah,
Right.
and then you're also kind of almost spurred on to want to do that more, which I've appreciated so much.
Yeah, it's like almost an embarrassment. I'm like, oh no, they might catch me. Like I'm reading the Jungle
Put
Book.
another book behind it.
Yes, yes, all the things.
Tolstoy, War and Peace.
Yeah, oh yes, Dostoevsky. Like, but yeah, no, yes, to your point, yeah, very. It's a benefit being able to come back to it, kind of if you've already read it, but then also with that being able to be surprised by how
Right.
rich these seemingly simplistic stories are.
Yeah, I think Dr. Cuddeback released a couple weeks ago, I think, he released, there's like a book list that his wife Sophia came up with on like books that your kids should read.
Nice.
And I don't know how closely that's related to John Senior's list, because I think he
Yep.
has a list of 1,000 books, and it's broken down by ages. I think a lot of the books that he mentions for kids like are very similar to what she says with like, Winnie the Pooh and
Beatrix Potter, probably.
right, and not as much just like Dr. Seuss and
Yes.
which I don't think are bad, but in terms of like timeless classics that are out there, these are things you
Dr.
should read.
Seuss is a timeless classic.
Well, not according to John Senior, so
Yeah, it wasn't on the list.
it wasn't on the list, buckaroo. But it made me think that it's kind of an interesting insight, because you were saying that students at Christendom are grateful that they're kind of forced to read these books.
Yep.
Even though they maybe chose the class or chose to be an English major, they're forced to read these books that they wouldn't otherwise. But it's also interesting to think about if you put yourself in a position, even if you don't go to school, if you put yourself in a position to either make a list and go read these books, you can, or put yourself in a position where you're babysitting your nieces and nephews or your younger siblings, or you have kids of your own, and then that's the opportunity that you get to, and maybe it's the first time you've read the book, and I think that's a really beautiful thing. And I think a lot of I think most parents would say that the idea of sitting in their living room reading books out loud to their kids is like top-notch
Yes.
quality time.
Oh, yes.
And maybe watching a good movie with your kids is up there too. But because you can read it, maybe you've read it before, maybe you haven't, but you get to read a book and you get to experience your side of it, and you're kind of picking up on all of the true things that are applicable to real adult human life and suffering, and then your kids are getting it at their intake is at a very minimal level, and you can kind of see the disparity and also the beauty in either the depth of the work or what they're picking up. And I don't know, there's kind of like an interesting play there that you might get as a student for sure, because you're going through it with other people and actually like breaking it apart, which you're probably not doing when you're reading to your kids. But also when you're reading with your kids or someone else's kids, there's kind of like this really simplistic approach that maybe you kind of overlook because you start analyzing it, and they just look at it as like a simple good and bad.
Yes. Yes.
Anyway, there's probably more to be said about that. It just crossed my mind.
No, it's so true. First of all, the value of reading out loud, that just cannot be duplicated. There was another comment on the Wind in the Willows, the son of the illustrator of Goodnight Moon. I have this book entitled Everything I Need to Know in Life I Learned Through a Children's Story. But he said that in college, just he and some friends, they gathered. It was probably like a wintry evening. They gathered in the room, all cramped around, and they read out loud The Wind in the Willows. And he said it just kind of cast this enchantment over the group. There's something about that sharing, engaging in your senses with something that is beautiful and something that resonates in a way different from a movie. And I think too nowadays, because movies are so popular, we're all like, oh, I know the story of Cinderella, I know the story of The Little Mermaid or something, and then you go back to the original. So the Hans Christian Andersen Little Mermaid, I get so frustrated by the Disney movie for multiple reasons, but also because in the story, she wants to be human, not necessarily to get the guy to marry the prince because she wants a human soul.
Right.
She wants to be immortal. And then she actually doesn't even marry the prince. He falls in love with the other girl, which is part of it. It's in the movie. And then she's told by the sea witch or whoever, enchants her, well, you have to kill him in order for you to regain, your whatever, all the things. And so she doesn't, because she sees how happy he is. And so she dissolves into sea foam for 1,000 years. And then after 1,000 years of this suffering, so to speak, she does attain a soul. She attains immortality. And I'm like, wow, that's a whole nother level and depth that the movie is just kind of like, oh, love story. And we're like, no, we're talking about immortality here. And, and the other Hans Christian one, too, is the Snow Queen, where part of the little girl's quest to save her friend who's had his heart frozen by... the ice that distorts all good into evil, and his heart is slowly getting frozen. And part of her quest, she has to rearrange these pieces of ice. I think it's ice, and they spell out the Our Father. I'm just like, that's
And that became Frozen. Is that right?
Yeah.
Is that what Frozen's based on?
I think so.
I mean, that's
Frozen,
kind of the main plot.
It is that the heart gets frozen. The original fairy tale has seven parts of. It's a very long quest and full of random things. But yes, I think the Disney Frozen is based on that. But obviously taking.
But they left out the Our Father. Everything else
left out,
sounds pretty
and the
much
guardian
same.
angel. She has like a guardian angel army helping her save her little friend.
That's
it's
amazing.
really
Yeah.
good.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah, that is so lost from all the movies. And
Man,
But,
before we get into
Yeah.
literature a little bit more, can we just talk about how you ended up at Christendom? Was that
of course.
just happenstance? Was that
Yeah.
something you pursued?
Yeah, no.
How unhappy are you there? No, I'm just kidding.
I love it. Totally providential. So at Catholic University, after finishing all of my course requirements and working on the dissertation, you're of course applying in all these various places, and then end up getting a job at a high school. And then still through connections from TAC, I was asked to join Chelsea Academy down the road. And so that was really great. And then I applied to teach one just adjunct at Christendom. So I was like, however long it can work. And then I was able to now apply for the full-time position. And I say it was providential because, at that point I was teaching at Christendom, but I was also part-time at Chelsea and applying to teach full-time at Christendom. So through that process, which is very intense and very involved, and the actual interview process is 2 full days of you give a lecture attended by your potential future colleagues, and then you are teaching a class that's observed also by your potential future department and any other professors who are able to attend various meetings throughout the various offices on campus. It's just 2 long days, and a benefit obviously had been there, so I was actually teaching my own students. I do remember a student on that day giving me a little thumbs up in the back, you can do it. Because it is nerve-wracking. You're staring at, first of all, your class of students, and then you've got 10 professors in the back of the class, and
shaking their heads.
Yeah, I know. I was like, what are they going to think? And so that whole, that was a very intense process, and just putting it all in God's hands. And then I received the official congratulations, you have been accepted to Christendom College as an assistant professor in the Department of English Language and Literature. So excited. I was so happy. And I was like, great, yes, let's do this. And I, 2 days later, put on my backpack and I, get ready to go home back to the Shire for spring break of March 2020. And the world shuts down. And I just had this overwhelming sense of, wow, the ways of providence, because, nobody would have been brought to campus for any other time. I mean, we were very as close as we could for that whole next year, like hiring freezes or, all of these things. And I just was, kind of in awe of the timing and God, bringing me out to Front Royal for the year before I was able to apply to Christendom, being able to be at Christendom while I was applying, having it all accepted, and then going home and again, everything shutting down, but I was in.
Right. Yeah.
And so it's just I think staying alert to these calls of the Holy Spirit, because I wasn't sure when my TAC connection brought me out to Chelsea. I was like, I don't really know. Like, I had a friend group and everything up in the DC area from Catholic University, and I was like, Front Royal, I don't know. And then I remember when I first drove down to look at Chelsea and interview there, it was so foggy and misty, and I just had this experience as I'm driving on the 66. I was like, I'm going into the unknown.
Did you break out into song?
Yeah, it was before that one, but yes, had I known that one, I would have. And then another time trying to, figuring out where would I live down in Front Royal. That second time I drove down, it was pouring rain, like sky opened up, so much rain. And my GPS brought me through what's that turn behind the Apple House?
Dismal Hollow.
Yeah. It took me to Dismal, and it was flooded, and I couldn't get through. That part, that narrow turn where there's a pond right there. Mm-hmm. It was flooded. I couldn't get through. I was like, I don't know what to do. And then I tried to turn back, and then another part of the road was flooded. I could see the 66, and I'm like, can I drive up this grassy slope to get back? And at that time, I was texting, my potential housemates, and I was just like, I can't the roads are flooded. And she was like, well, we have a friend who has a boat if you're ever stuck.
Oh my gosh.
And I eventually I was on the GPS. It was 5 minutes away from the house that I was supposed to look at to see if I was going to live there. And I turned around and drove back to DC. I couldn't get there. And again, I was like thinking, is this another sign? I don't know. But eventually, it all worked out. But it's just so interesting the way when you look back of how I was led to certain places, but also, you're always given a chance to say no. You're always given a chance to turn back. And I'm glad I didn't, take the fog or the, the flooded roads as sort of like, well, that's God telling me don't do this. You've been given a great gift and you got to pursue with trust and faith. So, but I think it's funny coming on down, and it's not smooth sailing, and, just in those small ways. But you see the goodness of the goal, and you just keep moving forward to that.
How different was it coming into Christendom if you were, obviously you had been to 2 other schools, but like the Socratic method, the seminar based in TAC that you really, really liked. And I think with literature, you have more of a seminar base rather than you're just lecturing at students. Yeah. Is it super different than what you experienced at TAC? Do you try to implement some things that you experience at TAC into your classes at Christendom? What's that sort of like? Yeah, no, awesome question. I definitely, try to incorporate more of those discussions, because it is literature and you have to have that kind of collaborative conversation. It's harder with the Monday, Wednesday, Friday. 50 minutes flies by. So I really liked the Tuesday, Thursday. And when I was adjuncting at Christendom, I had an evening class, and that was perfect. So I loved evening classes. 3 hours. It go in depth. You have more leisure. Yeah. It kind of feels like this. You're like, we've got time. Let's just sit and talk. So, I might actually ask for evening class next semester.
Can I do all evening classes?
Yes. But basically, you do want to make sure that you are teaching the text and certain ways in which I have to get through elements of, say, the Iliad or the Odyssey. So I always start class with, that kind of opening questions. Okay, what would people respond to? Things like that. And then throughout the whole class, as I'm giving the lecture, I'm asking questions. And so it just, we all experienced online classes. That was terrible. And we have this gift of being in person. So I always encourage the students and try to create an atmosphere of comfort where we're here in person. Let's take advantage of this.
Yep.
And so yeah, it's more. I know I talk more than the students do, but that's just kind of the nature of our setup and the time. And
do you find that a lot of guys usually aren't as vocal? Because I was a political science major, and in my classes, usually the guys were more vocal than the girls because they were either more comfortable with the subject matter or they kind of wanted the debate.
Yeah.
But my experience of literature classes were usually that the guys were like, okay, we just have to get through this. And if it's like a point that I like particularly disagree with, I'll say something, or if I like the book that we're reading, maybe. But usually it was the girls saying, well, I read this and like this really struck me and I thought this was beautiful. Yeah, a lot of I feel statements, and the guys were like, it was fine, whatever. And it wasn't like that. I think sometimes it wasn't even that the guys weren't trying. It was just it wasn't as engaging as they would have liked, or they had their opinions, but then the teacher kind of stated what they were thinking, and so they just didn't speak up. So do you find that that's hard to engage the guys of the class?
Sometimes I think it really does depend on the text. So I just remember, teaching the Iliad, the Odyssey. I think it just gets everybody invigorated. I'm invigorated about it, and which is surprising, or confused, but I mean, yeah, I think it's a mix, but I'd always want to offer them the opportunity to let's see ourselves in the story. So the benefits of literature, which we can talk about more, but it offers you that particular experience of a particular time, place, and character, and then through that particular, you're gaining the universals, like you're seeing the philosophical, theological truths, or political truths, etc. So it's kind of funny, like say you're walking in sophomore year, and we're set to read Crime and Punishment. And I'm like, now, all of you 18-year-olds in front of me, 18, 19-year-olds in front of me, you might not think that you have anything in common with a 19-year-old Russian axe murderer, but you do. And so, or again, taking it back to, like, you might not think that you have anything in common with a pagan 20-year-old, 25-year-old warrior Achilles, but you do. Like, he too is struggling with mortality and the desire to be glorious. And I'm like, just if you read any, kind of like saint, like the beginning of the Mass, what's that called when they say, I forget what it's called, but anyways, but sometimes like
the collect.
Yes, thank you. And then it's like, and Saint John of the Cross, who achieved imperishable glory. And I just go back to, oh my goodness, that's what the pagans want. Like in all of Homer and Iliad and the Odyssey, they too wanted to achieve this imperishable glory. Right. They just obviously didn't have the benefits of divine revelation. And so, yeah, seeing those types of similarities, like human nature is obviously the same. Just the time, place, and circumstances change. So kind of expands your awareness of your connectivity with the world gone before you and in the current time when you're reading literature, because you realize, that's me, that's us, that's my friends. And
which is crazy to think about, the objective truth in kind of everything. It doesn't matter if you're a Catholic or secular or an atheist. There are certain things that everyone just kind of has to agree upon, and human nature is one of those things. So it doesn't matter what kind of literature you're reading, there's going to be something for everybody, and you're going to sort of relate to whatever you're reading
in some way. I mean, if it's true, like if it's not trying to impose a specific, I'm going to change what human nature is, and then you kind of get those elements of bad literature.
I actually found that I remember talking with some of my classmates about like pagan works and why we should read pagan works and things like that. And I think a lot of it came down to like, they don't have good, these pagan stories don't usually have good morals, but they do have virtue, which almost sounds like it's not possible to have both, but it is, because in a sense it'll have a soldier and it'll glorify like horrible killings and like rape and having multiple partners and all of these things. That's just part of the glory of being a soldier. But at the same time, which is bad, but at the same time it'll emphasize glory and honor and like the importance of being willing to die for a cause and all of these things that I think a lot of times in Catholicism, other than the saints, especially in modern times, we don't necessarily have either examples of that, or we don't really have a good idea of what that looks like. And of course, there are the saints that did that we can look to, but there's not that same sense of like patriotism or willing to die for a cause or for people. It's all very like, I feel like Catholicism in itself in many ways has become kind of focused on the individual, which can be good if you're talking about your individual perfection. But if you're talking about being selfless and doing things for others, I feel like sometimes pagan literature is actually better at showing what that looks like and just like donning your armor and going into battle than what we have today.
Yeah,
you know?
no, I would definitely say that certainly about literature, modern literature today. I remember reading an article about Homer, how he really did clarify what it means to be great for that time, for that culture. This is the great man, the man who has the kleos. You know, his name is going to be immortal, and so Homer portrayed an entire culture. And in the article, it said, "Do we have an American Homer? Is there an artist? Is there an author who is showing us not only who we are, but what we ought to be?" And, you know, the word ought always implies that moral decision.
Right.
So, you know, the American Homer, is it Melville? Is it, you know, not Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn? I hope it's not Gatsby. You know, that's would be terribly tragic if it was. But it's, yeah, I think the sense of identity as that collective, you know, common good, literature can portray it, because, yeah, it can capture true life, but it also can capture the ideals, which is obviously what we want to have. Again, kind of going back to trying on in the wardrobe of our imagination. So, yeah, I think literature nowadays, it's so individualistic, it's so specified. I can't think of an author, at least a living author currently, who is kind of capturing the sense of the whole, maybe because we don't have the whole, too fragmented.
Would you say that Mark Twain arguably is like America's author, or do you think that someone else maybe has that?
Yeah,
title?
I think, yeah, it is interesting because Huck Finn too can be characterized as the American Odyssey in some ways. It's traveling down. Yeah, I'm not sure. It's something still to keep pondering. I know that during World War II they would send works of literature to soldiers overseas as sort of a reminder of what you're fighting for. Like, this is who you are. This is what we're fighting for. And they actually included Little Women on the list of books sent to the soldiers. I'd be interested. I only remember that because I was like, oh, of course, yes, they should have sent that. But I actually would go back and see what were some of the other books that they would send to. Actually, they didn't just send it to the American soldiers, but they would send it to other countries of this is who, you know, we are. This is what America is. So I'd have to go back to that list. Trying to remember the other ones on it. But I guess, you know, any of those works would be pre-1940s.
Okay.
Yeah.
With one of the things that I kind of remember, I remember you talking about in one of the, like, the principal lectures that you did.
Oh, yeah.
Actually, I think it was on Jane Austen, or it was on
Yes.
Pride and Prejudice and everything.
Yes.
And one of the things, so the only book that by Jane Austen that I've read is Northanger Abbey, which I only read because of Dr. McInerney's class at the Extended Imagination.
The Extended Imagination, yeah.
Right, and I actually, so it was, I don't think I would have read it prior if I didn't have a class for it. But one of the things I think I remember you saying was it's very apparent that, like, where the virtue is. And then also in Northanger Abbey, it's actually really interesting because it's this I forget who the main character is.
Catherine.
But
Yeah,
Catherine,
yeah.
she's this kind of she reads a lot, but then is reading these kind of books that are kind of keeping her heads in the clouds and not bringing it down. And then she's like learning through. So you're almost like through a book that you should be learning about virtue. This person, the main character, is learning about virtue too, which I thought was really cool.
Yes.
But so I do want to ask, what is, I mean, with all of Jane Austen's works, especially for men, I guess with that in mind about like how virtue is very apparent. I guess I don't know if you can expound upon that or just kind of talk about that.
Yeah.
Why should men read Jane Austen?
Yes,
Exactly.
great question. I'll give my short answer because she makes virtue both attractive and attainable. Short answer. No, it was good. Now we can move on. No, it was good. But yeah, she does portray human nature spot on. She's such a keen observer of the way in which we internally understand each other and the way in which we externally act, and kind of those discrepancies of here's the polite veneer of proper social decorum. Internally, let me provide my commentary. And so she kind of calls us out sometimes or frequently on that. But for men in particular, she does have an insight into, I would say, like the feminine mind that is very attentive to details, and the way in which she's portraying her characters. She allows any of us readers to recognize that the woman is going to read certain words or actions that are said to her in a way that would fit. I guess we all kind of do this, but what she would hope that it intends, and how easily there can be those misinterpretations or misunderstandings. But yeah, her male characters in particular, the examples of fatherhood present are not stellar, and so you can really see the desire to have a good, virtuous father figure by what is lacking. And then in terms of husbands, I mean, it's kind of fatherhood and being a husband and two similar. Friendship here is really interesting. Austen very rarely gives just male characters talking on their own. There's always another female character present, or it's filtered through Austen's narrator, her omniscient narrator. So the friendship that is portrayed amongst men is also sparse. You've got Darcy and Bingley. You've got in Emma, you've got the two brothers. There's this great friendship. It's like one says John, and the other says, I forget his name, like Edward, and they shake hands. And just in the simple shaking of hands, it's like, and yet each would die for each other, that type of a thing. But I think one of the benefits, and I did bring Emma, if there's time I can read a passage, but one of the benefits too is seeing friendship, this kind of fraternal correction that occurs in a friendship between a man and a woman, so Mr. Knightley and Emma. And I think in particular for all of us, but perhaps for men, like having that fraternal brotherhood where you want to will the good of your friend. You want him to succeed in his pursuit of virtue and of goodness. And so how do I reach out and help them in this endeavor? Austen can portray that even though it's not amongst men. Should I read a passage?
Yeah, go
Do
for
it.
it.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's from Emma, and this is Mr. Knightley. Emma has in public, she has insulted one of their neighborhood friends, and in their little small community. So this woman, is kind of a chatterbox, and Emma makes fun of the fact that she doesn't stop talking. And it really embarrasses this woman. The others in the group notice it, and Emma takes a while, like she kind of realizes the mood has shifted, but it isn't until her friend, Mr. Knightley, comes to her, and then he says these words. So I'll look around, I'll read here. He looked around as if to see that no one were near, which I think also is really cool. I'm just interjecting because he's waiting until they're alone. He's not fraternally correcting her in front of everybody. And then he says, "Emma, I must speak once more to you, as I have been used to do. A privilege rather endured than allowed, perhaps, but I must still use it. I cannot see you acting wrong without a remonstrance. How could you be so unfeeling to Miss Bates? How could you be so insolent in your wit to a woman of her character, age, and situation? Emma, I had not thought it possible." She responds, and then he continues on, and he basically gives rationale. Her situation should secure your compassion. It was badly done to laugh at her, to humble her. And he says, this is not pleasant to you, and it is very far from pleasant to me, but I will tell you truths while I can, trusting that you will sometime or another do me greater justice than you can do now. Okay. And then he takes her into the carriage. She has her face turned because she's by this time crying. He misinterprets her reaction. And then too late, she turns back and tries to look back at him. But again, it's too late. And yeah, it's just scenes like this. There's little moments sprinkled throughout all of Jane Austen in which you see the role of that man and woman relationship being enacted in a way that's trying to bring the other to virtue. The classic example, obviously, is in Pride and Prejudice. Mr. Darcy proposes to Elizabeth Bennet, does not go well, goes about it in the wrong way, insults her as well, and she fires back, and then he's offended and she's offended, and it leads to great distress on both sides. But the way in which they learn to now understand each other through later interactions, and how she learns to gain respect for him and gratitude toward what he's done for the family, it's very Christian. It's very also Aristotelian in the sense that you're aiming towards, if you're at the routine, you're aiming towards a mean of the kind of these excess ways in which we respond out of emotion. And it ends with, for the characters who have the strength to admit their faults, it ends with that growth, that actual maturity in whatever virtue that they're lacking in. So in Emma's case, it starts off, the first sentence starts off with Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever, and rich, with a comfortable home and happy disposition, seem to unite some of the best blessings of existence. So the key of the word is some. So she's actually missing charity. She's missing compassion. And so this whole scene of fraternal correction, which is really difficult on both sides, that's now the spark that's going to just ignite in her deep internal reflection and actual positive action to now grow in compassion and charity. So yeah, I think for men in particular, not only is it a beautiful book, it's intellectually engaging because her writing is stellar. And it just, gives insights into the workings of the female mind. I think in particular, Austen, wrote what she understood and knew, but also just the value of the relationship between man and woman on various levels. If it's family, if it's friend, if it's spousal, she shows how it's difficult to know and understand each other, how we often misunderstand, misinterpret, and get frustrated, and yet how we can work through those confrontations to a greater understanding. And it's never perfect, but there's progress.
I guess two things that I would say. The first thing is kind of a comment of agreement, and I think that just based on what you just read, it's interesting to me that you have such a clear example of the man stepping in and saying, you messed up, but not in a holier than thou way, and not in a, like, I command you to do this kind of way, but like you were saying, in a very, like, fraternal correction, like, I'm doing this because I love you.
Yes.
And also the way that he handled it, he didn't just stand up and say, oh, you're being ridiculous, darling, in front of everyone.
Yes.
He waited until the proper time, which shows prudence. He didn't get angry. He doesn't raise his voice. So to me, that's fascinating because a lot of times, maybe not in literature, but at least in modern like movies and shows, the husband or the father is kind of the bumbling idiot who does everything wrong. And then the wife just says, okay, you're kind of stupid. Here's what you need to do. And that's based on a stereotype of men not picking up on social cues, and all of those things are true, but it also paints the man as this person who should be meek, who should step down, who should just listen to his wife, and not as someone who maybe is wrong sometimes in being vindictive and even aggressive in dealing with situations. but it paints that entire response as bad, as opposed to saying, no, there's a prudent way to correct someone.
Yep.
But also, if there is a situation where we need to get violent or angry, you're the person that needs to step up. Like, the wife shouldn't have to do that. So it's interesting that it seems to frame the masculine response in a very prudent way, without taking away from him or without putting his wife down or without doing any of those things. It just shows, like, this is the correct response. A guy should be able to see the injustice and step in, even if it means correcting, and not just, okay, whatever you want, honey.
Yes.
And sometimes that is the right response, but also it's clear that maybe she doesn't have charity, and that he does need to step in and say, you hurt this woman's feelings.
Yes.
You should probably apologize, or, make it right.
Yes. No, very well said.
I guess the second thing that I would say is more of not a criticism, but I guess a bit of a pushback. Do you think that men have trouble reading Jane Austen because it's so descriptive and probably more appealing to women in terms of, like, this person said this and they were wearing this and they thought about this, and guys are like, where's the action?
Right.
Like, is there a fight? Where's do you think that is a flaw in Austen's work, or do you think that she's trying to maybe call men to kind of put themselves in the position of what women are going through in order to teach them something?
Yeah. I think more on the latter. It's she was definitely self-aware that she knew she was not writing. She was not a Russian novelist who's writing of wars and great deeds and things like that. She had a very small focus, and in that very small focus, she is detailing the very minutia of life. Of, we're going for walks and this is what we see, and we're setting up this room for a ball, and this is what we need to do. It's actually hilarious, and I think you guys have all worked for SAC, and there's probably maybe 4 pages, like, it just goes on and on and on in Emma, where they are looking at these rooms. There's 2 rooms and then a long hallway, and just analyzing everything. Well, if we put the chairs here, and then, well, what about the food? And then, well, these windows, and then, well, we need some area over here for the dancing and the cards and the this and this and this. And I, reading it out loud in class to the student, I'm like, has anybody ever put on an event? This is what it is. Like, this, again, it's human nature. But yeah, it's just a side tangent of the amount of detail that she can go into in terms of where you might be like rolling your eyes and skim. But yeah, I think there is a benefit as a man to be able to have the patience, perhaps, or sort of the mindset of, this is going to bring me into a more detailed I'll just go with more detailed perspective than perhaps I'm used to, and yet still it's something that's familiar, and it's something that I can understand, and something that I can again recognize as this is true. So I think there's a benefit to that, but it certainly is I don't know if it's an acquired taste, but it's something where if reading it isn't immediately in grabbing your attention, then perhaps it's something more of an audiobook, because it does sound like a conversation. If you're reading Jane Austen out loud, you're just like, it sounds as if you're overhearing people talk on the train, or in rooms and things like that. She's great to read out loud. She would practice reading out loud to her family. She would read snippets from her drafts. She would kind of stand up in front of the room and kind of perform it. And so, I think it's meant to be kind of in that culture in which you would gather after dinner or whenever, and you would read stories out loud to each other, and, pre-radio and all that. So, yes, benefits of reading Jane Austen as a man in particular can introduce you to perhaps a perspective that is more detailed oriented, but still familiar and good.
Something that struck me was, as you were describing, like, setting up the ballroom
Yes.
or whatever, and I'm not well read on Jane Austen. I've only read Sense and Sensibility, I think, and I couldn't tell you a thing about it.
There's sensible people, and then there's not so.
I think, I don't know about you guys, but the stigma is just, for guys especially, it's just, it's just some boring romantic novel.
It's a girl's book,
blah,
yeah.
blah, blah, blah. And as you read the passage and as you sort of went through the description of the ballroom, which I thought was so funny, it's kind of just in our culture, it's just real life because as Anthony mentioned, where are the fights? Where's all this? I mean, nobody's getting into fights these days.
Yes.
People are having conversations with each other. People are internally struggling rather than externally struggling with fights and battles. So I think for something that is more realistic and more relatable to this day and age is awesome. And I think also the relationship between like the man and the woman, not just in a romantic point of view, but
it's
in
not just romance.
in a friendship, in a professional relation. It's awesome to see.
No, that's so true. She's portraying daily life and, perhaps all of its mundane trivialities, but really she's portraying the struggle of the soul.
Right.
How am I supposed to act in this situation? There's this really interesting scene in Sense and Sensibility where the most polite of the sisters, so there's one who's very sensible and rational and prudent, and then there's one who is totally not, all the excess of all her emotions. And there's a scene where there's been startling news, and the sensible sister, she recognizes internally, it's up to me to carry on the polite conversation because my other sister, my Marianne, she's not capable of doing that because she's so emotional and excessive. And so you have this, again, kind of interplay. Externally, she's doing the proper, polite, socially respectable give and take, engaging people in the conversations. Internally, she's chaotic. Like, she's in such pain from hearing this news. She's like internally she's struggling, upset, and so she kind of has this phrase of, it's up to me though to tell the polite lies in order to preserve this decorum and respect. Polite lies in the sense of, I'm saying things that I do not feel,
Right.
but out of respect to the neighbors, to the people who are visiting here, I'm going to do what's right in this situation, what's prudent in this situation, even though internally I wish I could just scream and run out of the room. So that type of interplay too of our external obligations to our neighbors, and again, it's not just family members or romance. I get it, the girl and the guy get together at the end of all the books, but in surprising ways. But yeah, it's more of, we all desire that integrity of what we say matches up with what we think, what we do matches up with what we say. But there are times where we're not being hypocritical, but we are out of care and compassion for those around us in that daily setting. We have to speak and act in a way that we don't feel, but for them, for the sake of the common good.
Right.
And so I really admire that. In one of her other stories, Persuasion, it's her last book she wrote before she died. She died very young. She died at 35 or 41. She started publishing her works at 35. So she kind of had this very, she had a fascinating life. If we have time, I'd love to tell you more about Jane Austen's life, but fascinating life in very confined households. But she, in her final book, Persuasion, she has an older heroine. She's 27, not the typical 19 or 20-year-old. And this heroine has already had her love when she was 17, 18 years old. And so it's been several years, and this guy was a naval officer, and so he's back in the neighborhood. And this character, Anne, she's the rock of the family, but they don't recognize her as such. They're very vain, selfish. The rest of her dad, her sisters, they're all only concerned about their own desires and comforts. And they're like, oh, blah, 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 blah. I want to do this, this, and this. And we're going to ignore Anne. She's just Anne. They don't value her. They don't see her. They don't recognize she's actually the one holding the family together. And when the naval officer comes back into the neighborhood, you see again the intensity of the feelings of the main character that she cannot reveal, because it's not appropriate, it's not prudent, and sort of the interior strength depicted in this story in particular is so, I would say, a strong, attractive way to demonstrate interior strength, like this right. Strength of will, strength of virtue. It's very frustrating understandable when modern movie adaptations, particularly of this book, show a feisty heroine. She's sassy. She's like quick with the responses. She's like, blah, 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 I'm not going to deal with these people. And that's so not the book. But I was thinking about that, and I was thinking, gosh, it must be difficult for Hollywood and to be able to show an engaging, attractive, I don't mean just physically, but an attractive character who is silent, who is quiet,
Right.
who is, kind of off in the corner and content to hide behind the piano and play while everybody else dances and has fun. And that's your heroine. That's your main character. How do you portray interior strength in a way in which, people find it desirable? And like, I want to be that quiet, shy girl in the corner playing the piano. I don't want to be out there on the dance floor dancing because she's awesome. You get that through reading the book. I haven't seen it successfully done, in a visual
Right.
adaptation. There are some better adaptations than others, but that's sort of the power of Austen as well, of sort of fighting back against the mode of, well, if I'm not expressing everything I feel, then I'm not honest. So I'm going to just say everything that I think and feel because that's me, that's who I am, and you guys need to deal. That's not Austen. Austen's like, do what's prudent, do what's charitable, do what's compassionate, do what's best for the common good of your family, of your community. Be your, flourish as an individual with your individual gifts and strengths, but put that higher good first.
Can I ask a question about persuasion?
Yeah.
When this Navy guy comes back and all of her emotions or whatever, and,
So strong.
and it's like she can't really express that because if she did, the family would kind of break apart. Is that kind of?
Yeah. He's still wounded from her rejection back when they were teenagers, so he's coming back because he has family in the neighborhood as well. On the lookout for a wife, and she's not on the list.
Okay, I see.
Sounds
I
like
see.
he needs to get over it.
So it's a very self-sacrificial.
Totally
Yeah. Or in that case too, that's what Austen also shows. There are appropriate times to express your feelings. He had hidden his hurt. She could sense it. She's very sensitive. She can pick up, oh wow, he's still mad at me. It's been 7+ years. I still like him, and look at him looking at these other girls dancing while I'm hiding behind the piano. But yeah, it's a self-sacrificial love. Spoiler alert, it ends happily. but again, there's growth. I actually would recommend you guys reading Persuasion. There's growth on his side too. Like, probably we see more internal the consciousness from his character than we do in other Austen books. She'll go inside a character's mind and heart very often, but usually it's a female character.
Would you recommend Persuasion to male readers over any of the other books, or do you think that there's a particular work of Austen that either is better to read for men or at least just easier? Like, if you're a guy who's never read Jane Austen and you're like, okay, not a huge fan of the idea, but I'll give it a shot. Do you think that Persuasion is a good one to start with, or is there another one that you think is an easier read, or maybe
He's
more
asking for
interesting
us.
read?
I was gonna say you all need. Well, I think yes, Persuasion, but no, read Pride and Prejudice first.
Okay. And would Pride and Prejudice be your recommendation
Yes.
across the board?
Yes,
Okay.
it is, and she characterized it herself. It is, quote, the most light and bright and sparkling. It's the most dialogue heavy. I would say it's the easiest read, in the sense of you're not going to get lost in that complex, intricate structure of sentences. But it is, it's just fun and funny, has the depth, has sort of that, again, that interior struggle that we all go through, even if you are primarily seeing it from the girl's perspective, Elizabeth. But it's so applicable of how many times that we have certain standards by which we're judging others, and then we realize those standards are out of priority. And so what you're really seeing is someone who, based on her standards of this is how a man should act, this is how a gentleman should act, this is how a gentleman should act at a dance, since the main character doesn't meet at all any of her standards, she rejects him, and then everything else is filtered through that rejection. And so further information that she gains, well, it further substantiates the fact that he's beneath my notice, so to speak, and he's frustrating and annoying, until, and it comes in the middle of Pride and Prejudice. And I talked about this in that talk I gave for principles, until she's actually able to see his interior consciousness through a letter. And that's pretty much the only time that we see, no way, I actually was acting according to a different set of standards at this particular moment. I did have reasons which you don't know, and I'm going to explain now, for why I acted as I did. Yes, some of those ways in which I acted was wrong, but hopefully now you can see the justification. So, so Austen is just one of those authors that depicts how, based on a certain observation that we have, we reach conclusions. He acted this way, therefore not marriage material, so to speak, but she's the one who's asking us to consider, well, what are your standards? What are your principles? Are you putting at the very top a man of integrity, a man of virtue, or are you putting at the top rich, handsome, and good dancer? Which,
those are the top three, I thought.
Check. Those are, so that's fun to discuss too, of just sort of what are the principles Austen is presenting to us by which we are judging all the characters in the book. But yeah, long answer, read Pride and Prejudice first, and then read Persuasion. Persuasion is great for older
Are there any
readers.
movie adaptations that stand out from other movies as like, okay, this one, if you're going to watch any movie adaptation of maybe Pride and Prejudice or Little Women or something, this is the one to watch?
Yeah.
Or they're...
The classic Pride and Prejudice one came out in 1995. It's the BBC one, and Colin Firth. It's just classic. You can hear quotes from Austen in that book all the time, so like almost verbatim. Where I think, wow, the screenwriters had a pretty easy time. It just went back to the book. But I think that's also another element of the brilliance of her writing. For the multiplicity, hundreds of adaptations that are made by Austen, there's certain lines that seem to crop up in all these movies. You're like, it's that good. The whatever modern adaptation they're making, they still use her original text. So yeah, that's a really good one. I love the Sense and Sensibility one with Emma Thompson. There's lots of good ones. And then Emma, there's a great miniseries of Emma, and I don't know forget who's starring in that one, but there's one with Jeremy Northam. He's Mr. Knightley in one of them. Then usually too, like the aesthetic of the movies are, I like the ones where they're trying to still be in that kind of Regency era and kind of the music of the time that would be used. So, but you can get very different adaptations from Austen. I think she's telling again story of life, as you're saying, Mark. It's just life in all of its normalcy, but also too in its intense desire to have a good life and flourish in it, without the battles and the duels. There is a duel in Sense and Sensibility, but it's not described at all. So it's just
I remember that part. It was just, wow.
So good. All the drama. I will say the movie adaptation, they really play it up. There's like a whole scene. It's in mist and in the morning and like dramatic music. But the one line in it, so this man is defending the honor of his ward, and it just says, "They met by appointment. Neither was injured." Reading between the lines, they had a duel.
Oh my goodness.
Wow.
So that's it. Yeah.
A little disappointing.
A little bit disappointing. Yeah.
I felt the shot miss.
Yeah, exactly. In the mist. Yeah.
Give me some blood at least.
Nothing like that.
I would love to go into the life of Jane Austen.
Yeah.
But before you go into that,
Sure.
I'm curious, did you specialize in studying Jane Austen at CUA? Or is that something that as you were there, you just were like, oh, she's great. And then you've kind of just continued that education, and that's why you're so versed in Jane Austen now.
Both actually. So growing up, I had read it. I forget how old I was when I first read, and I know I did start with Pride and Prejudice too. I think it is her most accessible, and just loved it. I think I also felt like grown up, like, oh, I'm reading Pride and Prejudice. And then the rule in the Sullivan household was you cannot watch the movie unless you read the book first. So that was also an incentive to read the book so we could watch the movie. And then in grad school in Dallas, I took this class, just Jane Austen, which surprised and shocked and delighted me that, whoa, I get to spend an entire semester just on one author. Because at TAC, you're reading like so much all the time. You spend, 2 weeks on or 2 classes only on one book. So that was a delight. I loved my professor's way in introducing us to sort of, again, the intricacies of her writing. So having that class at UD, and then I had another class at Catholic University on 19th century British novels, which she was included in that. And then I wrote an essay for that class, for that seminar, and my professor was like, you know what, this essay could potentially be developed into a dissertation. So that kind of gave me the instigation for that. But I didn't just write on Austen for my dissertation. So I guess you would say my specialty isn't Austen, but it's the 19th century British novel. So in the dissertation, I had a chapter on Austen, but I also had a chapter on Dickens, William Thackeray, and then Elizabeth Gaskell. So kind of the broad sweep of that century. But yeah, it was such a delight. Last year I was able to teach a class on Austen here, and it was just wonderful.
Was that because of your request, or did the
Yeah.
college ask you to do that?
Nope. I requested, but so we have categories for our English major requirements where you have to take 2 classes from, medieval times to, say, I think we cut it like 1800s, and then you have to take 2 classes from the 1800s to modern. So it just fit in, category
Awesome.
B. Yeah. But yeah, Austen's
So,
life.
Jane Austen.
Jane
Yeah.
Austen's life. Well, she was born 1775, so near our American
Wow.
Revolution.
Whoa.
Yes. She was the 6th child of 7, and her parents, she was born in December, and her parents they had 5 boys, and they're like, and now we have a playmate for Cassandra. And so she and her only sister, Cassandra, they were best friends. And so when Cassandra was sent off to school, then Jane Austen wanted to go as well, because she just didn't want to be separated from her sister. And her mom, you can read in one of her letters, her mother wrote, if Cassandra were to be sent to the guillotine, Jane would follow. So, but it was quite sad. So their father, he was a reverend, he was a Anglican minister in England, and he had a boys' school in his home, so he would bring in some local boys, and he would, sometimes they would board, and so he would teach them. And it was rare for the time for Jane and her sister to kind of be given full access to their father's library, but they were just allowed to read, and they were very theatrical, and all of her older brothers were very artistic in that way. And so there's a lot of fun around the Austen, I guess, living room, putting on these plays. The second son, there was something wrong developmentally with him, that they actually fostered him out. The second son was given to be cared for by a local family in the neighborhood, because they're not sure if it was epilepsy or whatnot. In one of the letters, the parents described him as like, George is having less fits now. So they think it was seizures. It might have been something like that. And Mr. and Mrs. Austen, I guess, deemed that they couldn't give the proper care to this boy, to their child. And so, yeah, I know, it's kind of shocking, and you're like, oh, but also practice of the time was that sometimes the mother, after giving birth, she would give her baby to a local nurse to raise until the child started walking. So I think it was sort of like family, unity that we think about today, wasn't the same.
Right.
And then later on, Jane Austen, so technically third brother, but the second one had, been fostered out. The third brother, he was often invited to join one of Mr. Austen's wealthy relatives on their trips. They would travel to Europe a lot, and they would invite this other Austen son with them, and they didn't have any children, and they asked Mr. and Mrs. Austen, can we take him? Can we adopt him? And they said yes.
Wow.
So there's 2 sons. So, but it actually, and all the things that, worked out to the advantage. So he took their name too. He was Austen Knight, and he later on, he inherited this massive, wealth in this huge mansion, which is now a library today and a museum, Chawton House. So because later on in life, once Mr. Austen died, the mother, Mrs. Austen, Jane, and her sister had no income. They just didn't have anything. They kind of lived around with various family members for a certain amount of time, and so her brothers would take care of the women of the family. And so this adopted brother, with now all this wealth and this massive mansion, he's like, all right, mom, sisters, come live with us. But they didn't live in the mansion. They lived in the little cottage down on the very edge of the property, which
Was that their choice?
I think it might have been. It might have been the brothers too. Like, do I really want my mom living here? But it was, I guess, very pleasing to Austen because she set up her writing desk right by a window, which is you could see the road. And I just imagined she would sit there and write and look out the window and just kind of observe, again, life passing by.
Was it common for women to be writing at that time?
No. So this is also the funny part of it. So her dad did give her, which again was expensive for the time, like gave her a means to write little stories when she was a teenager. And they're published now. They're called her Juvenilia, and they're hilarious. They're so satirical and sassy. But yeah, and then she would kind of write novels that her brothers would encourage. Her brothers also wrote while they were in Oxford, like published magazines and things. But it wasn't common. So when she started writing after her dad's death, like more as a full time, because all throughout until then, until her 30s, she was dear Aunt Jane. Her brothers all got married, like 5, 10, 13 kids. And so she would stay, she and her sister would just go and stay at various amounts of times at her brother's homes. And at that time, a woman couldn't travel, at least of this social class of her own. They were kind of in the middling gentry class. So she'd have to wait until her brother could come and pick her up, take her to the house. You'd stay definitely at least a month or so, and then she'd have to wait until her brother was ready to bring her back or bring her to another place. And yeah, so that kind of was her life. She did receive, she kind of had this teen flirtation with a young Irish friend, a friend, right? They danced in a shocking way, she wrote in one of her letters. And
so magical.
Yeah, like so magical. Yes, it all happens at a dance. And he had a blue coat. And but eventually his relatives were like, well, we don't know, we don't want him marrying some, local, not very wealthy girl. So they sent him back to Ireland. And I guess later on he became like the Chief Justice of Ireland. And people who were fans of Austen tracked him down and asked him. And he said, yes, Jane Austen, it was a boyish love. So anyway, she did have that, I would say, romance. And then there was another, I think in her late 20s, one of her brother's friends proposed to her, and his name was Harris Bigwither. And she said yes, and then the next morning she said no, and immediately asked her brother to take her in the carriage away.
Oh my.
Yeah, and so much speculation. Why did she accept the proposal? Was she worried she'd be an old spinster? Why did she reject him the next morning? Did she think then my ability to write? You kind of get more of like.
She found out he couldn't dance.
That's that type of thing too. There's authors who are like, well, it's because she wanted to focus on career. I'm like, I kind of.
It was the blue coat.
It was the blue. Yeah. But
Irish.
Yeah, that was Irish. But I think it's just like she didn't want to marry without love, and so she never got married, but she lived with her sister and her mother for the rest of her life, and in that little cottage. And when she was writing her stories, she sent it off to one of the publishers through her brother. Her brother would help. They didn't publish it, and so she wrote this letter. She signed it like Mrs. Ashton Dennis, of like, how come you haven't published this? You've received my novel, etc. The acronym is MAD, Mrs. Ashton Dennis. So that's kind of like her mode. They eventually
subtle,
very subtle. Yeah, they eventually sent it back. They didn't publish it. And then, so her brother sent it off to another publisher who they did. And then it was never published under her name because it wasn't acceptable, really, to have a career as a writer. And then it's funny though. So after the other publisher published this book, her brother apparently wrote back to the original publishers and was like, by the way, the novel that you refuse is actually one of them, fastest published. Anyway,
Yeah.
but she had this little teeny tiny writing desk and apparently, or like a table where you could lift up and put paper inside of it. So she, I guess the door was squeaky. The front door of their cottage was squeaky. So whenever she heard the door squeak, she would put her writing inside that little table desk and take out her sewing.
Sneaky.
Why was writing like so looked down upon?
Yeah.
Like if she got caught writing, what would the
Because
punishment
she was
be?
a
She'd be
woman,
looking
or
for a
because it was
husband.
writing
I
in general?
think it was just as a woman,
Okay.
trying to live independently at the time. I don't know if if that really is. It is. I don't quite know. I think it just wasn't socially done for the.
It just seems like something that she would absolutely put in one of her novels. Like one of
Yeah.
the characters is secretly writing this
Yeah.
whole scandal, and you're
Yeah.
like, why is it a scandal?
Why is it a
like
scandal?
if she
Yeah.
makes money off it, great, and if
Yeah.
not, she just enjoys writing.
Oh, the
like
capitalist.
What's
I
the
know.
problem?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, at the time, so let's see, she first published 1818. I'm trying to remember. I think Frankenstein. Actually, I think Frankenstein. Mary Shelley published Frankenstein around then as well. The Bronte sisters were much later. They were in the 1830s. So prior to that, there were female authors. So in the 18th century, the big mode of writing were these sentimental novels, and the young heroine would go into the world and experience all the things and get in trouble and then be rescued.
Like
and
a Hallmark book.
Yes,
Yeah.
probably very excessive. And so maybe another element, Jane Austen is very, like if we were talking, very realistic, not cold in her emotions, because the emotions are present, but compared to what was in vogue, especially from female authors of her era, she was so different. She was sort of ahead of her time in that sort of realistic writing. Even if you've read any Charles Dickens, he can get very sentimental and excessive. And I love Dickens, but sometimes too, you're just kind of like your female characters in particular, not in Bleak House, but sometimes you're just like, they're not real. They're just, I don't know. Lucy she's just the light of the novel in A Tale of Two Cities, and there's not much else to her. So Austen was writing with this depth on realistic situations and again day-to-day life. So it wasn't what anybody was doing at the time. So maybe sort of her mode too was, people wouldn't understand, like I'm doing this type of writing that is delightful to me, but not what's in vogue.
Was she Anglican?
Yes.
Was she like, what was
Very
her sort
faithful.
of faith like?
Yeah. So you can actually, when you go to her house someday, I want to go, they have a framed prayer that she composed. And I think it is in her own handwriting. And part of it at the end of the prayer is the Our Father. But it's very, I wish I could read it. It's very, again, kind of focused on the common good. It's like, please let me do my duty. Please let me have compassion and charity. Like, dear Lord, help me to help those around me. That kind of element. So yeah, she was raised by her father, who was an Anglican minister. Two of her brothers entered the religious profession as ministers, which was seen as a career. It was like you were, a lawyer, you were a minister, you were part of the Navy. But yeah, she definitely understood that element of providence in all of her novels. There's a joy. Like, I think that's also what draws me to her. She's very joyful in the sense that no matter, again, how far you fall, there is restoration possible and achievable. And so that type of providential understanding, it's woven throughout her novels in a subtle way. It's you wouldn't really say, oh, Austen, Christian novelist, but it's there.
Right.
And it just too, like all the coincidences in Pride and Prejudice, there's a scene after the disastrous marriage proposal, like the two main characters just happen to bump into each other. And I love it because they bump into each other. And again, the last time they saw each other, it was painful. But they bump into each other. They're with Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, which are Elizabeth's aunt and uncle. They're with the actual gardener of the estate, and they're in the gardens. And I'm like, there's gotta be gardening imagery here. I'm probably reading way too much, but that's where the two main characters meet again, with having drastically different perspectives of each other by this point in the novel.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I kind of think like that's sort of a subtle way in which Austen is showing like, all right, we got to till the soil. It's going to be rough, but we got to plant the seeds, hopefully bear good fruit, kind of all that imagery happening. Those types of providential occurrences are in many of her novels. Yeah.
You mentioned that her, I guess, older brother who was adopted.
Yeah.
He became part of the Knight family. Is there any speculation about her character, Mr. Knightley, being related to that? Like, was that just a name that was in her mind, or do you think that was just kind of totally random?
Yeah, it could be random. She repeats names all the time. I that would be really cool if it did. In the book Persuasion, I was recommending, the main character is a naval officer, and he's portrayed very sympathetically, and he's the hero. And despite his still angst for 7 years, but two of her younger brothers entered the Navy, and they both had very illustrious careers in the Navy, rose to admiral, and so yeah, knightly, but also maybe the knight, the ideal chivalric Christian knight probably is the image there.
Tolkien is known for, his whole language creation, but also for names. Like, you break the name down and it's very specific, and the elves have a very specific way of being named and all that. Is there any sense in Jane Austen's work about, like, for example, Mr. Knightley being named that, and he's like kind of in the shadows, and he's and then there's like another do you find a correlation between the last or first name and what people would think, like a biblical name or something, and then you kind of see traits of that person, or does it seem more random in her works?
Yeah, no, there definitely is that element. So one of the more malicious character, his name is Mr. Wickham. Wickham. And then another character who is wishy-washy, his name is Willoughby, and it's kind of like, will he not? But also too, there's a character who he's not exactly admiring, although we understand why he acts the way. His name is Frank Churchill. I guess more sort of, you could see maybe the British prejudice against the French. But she does repeat names a lot, and it can get very confusing. There's so many Janes in her novels, but I don't think she's naming them after herself. It's just Jane. There's Edward, Edmonds, Mary, Anne, all very simple names like that.
It's the Catholic version of Joseph and Mary.
I think so. But yeah, definitely now and then she'll drop in a like Wickham, and you're like, well, even saying that sounds wicked.
Right.
So. But yeah, no, those are always fun little paths to travel down of why did she name this character in a certain way.
So I have a question about literature in general, and novels, and mostly novels, and but with, darn it, it's coming back, I promise.
Do you want me to ask my question and
Please
then you can go?
It'll come to you.
So
come
earlier
back.
we
I'm
were
so
talking
sorry.
about whether Mark Twain was the kind of prototypical American author. Do you think that there is a American poet or an American artist? I think before the show we were talking at your roommate's house.
Yes.
You have I believe they're your paintings of Norman Rockwell. And I mentioned the last time I was there how I thought that Norman Rockwell maybe or arguably is the American artist. Yeah. Not that doesn't mean that there aren't other good artists that live in America, but because America is so young, we don't have like the Caravaggio and the all of these different artists from America. Usually they're from other countries, and if you actually think about it, I don't know how many artists Americans could even name, but I know that Norman Rockwell is that one that he kind of shows the classic like 30s through 40s and 50s American like Christmas and very specific holidays and memories, and then there's all of this detail in the painting that seems very American-esque.
Yes.
Would you agree that maybe he's the American artist, or do you think there's maybe another list of artists that arguably could fit that
Yeah, no,
category?
it's a great question. I like that. I'm thinking there's comparisons between Rockwell and Austen. But yeah, no, to your point too. So actually it was Dr. Flippin who gave my housemate this great book, and so we have a Norman Rockwell. Anyhow,
Nice.
yes. So, but yeah, he definitely captures, especially in his Four Freedoms, that sort of a patriotic understanding that the common man can speak. So one of my favorite ones, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, is the town hall meeting where the man is standing up and he's looking forward, kind of upwards, and other people in the town hall are looking up at him or down at their program or elsewhere. And that, I think, just captures like, we all have a voice and we can use it and we ought to, and this is how we're going to move forward. And he's also a storyteller in his painting. So as you mentioned too, like there's so many details in one shot. I remember when I was at Catholic University, there was an exhibit downtown at the National Portrait Gallery in DC, and it was George Lucas and Steven Spielberg's personal collection of Norman Rockwell paintings, originals. Wow. Oh, it was awesome. And so I think I went a couple of times to the exhibit, and they had a little video portraying, Spielberg and Lucas talking about why they were drawn to Norman Rockwell. And they said that he captured an entire story in one frame, in one shot, so that all the background characters are contributing, the color scheme, the angle, the lighting, it's all contributing to telling a story. And Lucas was saying that was his goal when he's filming, to make every frame, every shot, all the details have to contribute to that story. So I don't know if that's particularly American, or if it's just an element of it. The great artist wants to make sure that there's nothing superfluous and all the pieces are contributing to the whole. So yeah, in that sense, you could make an argument that is an element of the American spirit, where we are all working towards, or I would say maybe in a town or a small community, you're all working hopefully towards that common good, and then everybody has their various role to play so that your individual good can flourish in the common good. So even if you're in the background, part of you is cut off, you're still contributing to the story.
Right. Something that strikes me about Norman Rockwell that you don't see in a lot of other artists, and I think that's what separates him in many ways from a lot of the other, just artists in general, or maybe American artists, is that when you look at his works, he's not painting like the crowning of Caesar, and like he's not doing these huge historical events. It's just like, oh, there's the soldier home from war, and it's very classic, like small town, relatable, patriotic American. Good, like I think one of his really famous ones is the Thanksgiving dinner table.
Yes.
You can't really capture that in this awesome huge painting of the Pilgrims, maybe, but what's more relatable is just everyone around the family table, and you see the different people are wearing different things from different generations, and they're all coming together in the chaos, and you're able to see that, which it just made me think, it seems like he is the prolific American artist, and I can't think of anyone else. There are other American artists, I'm sure, and maybe they're more versed in like religious paintings and things like that, but no one else comes to mind. And it's the same thing, I guess even more so with poets. I can't think of someone who's specifically an American poet who's just like really well known, beloved by all Americans. It's like, I guess there's a few, but it seems like Norman Rockwell is the only artist I could think of. And then in terms of poets, there's no one.
Yeah, I would say perhaps Robert Frost. If you've read some Robert Frost, which I do have a special affinity to him just because he lived in New Hampshire for a while. So, yay, the Shire. Yes.
He's a hobbit.
He is a hobbit, as a farmer. And his main mode of writing, he tried to capture conversations in the written word. So he had this phrase that you would hear the sound of sense in the written word. And so he gave the example that if you're standing behind a closed door and you hear murmuring behind the door of people having a conversation, just by their tones and inflections, you can get the general sense, okay, is this contentious? Is this, welcoming? Is this, what might it be? And so he tried to capture that real element of speech in his poetry. So yeah, he has these great conversational poems on that. And so I think that could be characterized as American in the sense that we are focused on the individual and the way in which they talk, but also the community of one of his famous poems is Mending Wall, where it's just two men. They have a stone wall between their property. They're not talking to each other as they're going line by line and putting in the stones to fix the stones that had fallen out. But the famous line is, good fences make good neighbors. Lots of people take that of like, yes, therefore stay away from me. But the whole element of the poem is there's a communal working together. And at one point in the poem, the man narrating it as they're walking along and fixing the stone wall, he looks at his neighbor in a different way. It's almost heroic of, wow, look how strong he is. And I've never noticed this before. And so that element of working together, like tough work, picking up stones, I guess maybe isn't that tough, but he has a lot of kind of those farming poems and the New England life of apple picking, kind of those poems. You got to dig into the earth that we've been given and nurture it and take care of it, but you don't do it alone, right? So maybe that also could be an element of the American artist.
A question, or you mentioned Mark Twain. I wonder what your thoughts on Flannery O'Connor were.
Yeah.
Just in terms of sort of that American author.
Yeah. She definitely is the Southern author.
Right.
Her mode too, I think, is maybe not so much she captures life as it is, but I think she has a more focused purpose. I want to capture light as it is, and I want the characters in the story, to see more, to see beyond their prejudices and their blindness. So she has this quote where she says the world, so she was writing in the 50s, 60s. She said that we are so deaf and we are so blind to God that at times the only way in which we can actually see or hear the workings of God is through violence. Violence she says there's twofold purpose of violence. Violence can it can both break you in such a way that it brings you back to reality, right, and also break open your stilted, calcified heart in such a way that you're now open and disposed to receive grace. However, you can still reject it. So her endings, if you've read any of her stories, some of them are more clear than others. Some of them are ambiguous. Will the character actually accept the grace that's being offered to him or her? So she's excellent in portraying us as we are, and then also showing us more, leading us beyond our falseness, etc. So her mode too, I really like using in my teaching of, it's the sacramental understanding of the world, where everything in our observations in our life is a sacrament. So it's that external sign of the invisible grace. So she's able to show us, even in these violent, shocking moments, when our pride is overturned, or our, prejudices are smacked or choked out of us, that also can be a moment where we are now led to see beyond the reality, to see now the invisible workings of God's grace in our lives. So I really like that about Flannery and other great artists.
It's such an interesting contrast. There's a specific word I'm looking for, but I can't think of it, to compare what like Dostoevsky would say in like, beauty will save the world, because that like beauty will bring you to God. But then maybe sometimes people are so blind to reality that you actually need like horror and violence to bring you to see God. I think there's a war correspondent, something Pyle, I could look it up. I think it's Ernie Pyle. And then he's later quoted by Eisenhower when he talks about there's no atheists in foxholes.
Yes.
Because you get to that point of we might blow up any second, and all of a sudden you don't know if there's God, but it's like Pascal's wager.
Right.
Like, well, I don't know if there is a God, But if there is,
Get my soul
I'd
in
rather
shape.
be
Yeah.
in good graces and have that work out, because
Yeah.
otherwise nothing happens. But if there's a chance, I'm gonna try to be a good person.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting contrast in the faith of like, you can see these great like virtue or great examples of heroic virtue and purity with Saint Therese and saints who just lived these perfect lives. And then on the other side, you see these saints who suffered all of
Yes.
these horrible things, and both lead to truth and grace, but from two different perspectives. And it
Totally,
kind of
yeah.
provides this example maybe for people who beauty almost doesn't work on them.
Yeah.
Like they're kind of so dead inside, or so, I don't know, like just completely lost and unfocused on what's actually good, that they need a wake-up call of like a car crash or like this really horrific like war
crash.
yeah something
Hey.
horrible to happen in order for them to be like, okay, wow, there actually are things that are important to me, and there is a good and evil.
Yes,
Which I think
yeah.
a lot of times maybe like school shootings or even 9/11 brings about this sense of, oh my goodness, there is evil, and then you have this unity despite political disagreements because of this other evil that maybe wasn't visible before, and all of a sudden the horror brings you to this realization of, no, there actually is good, and there's a good that's worth fighting for.
Absolutely,
right?
yeah.
As Tolkien says.
Yeah, well said. Yeah,
so-
and just so much is out of your control, and sort of reconciling yourself with that element of you think you have everything in control, so much is not, but still you can live you can live that productive life. And yeah, so one of my other favorite quotes is Fulton Sheen, where he says, "Broken things are precious. A broken ship saved Paul during the shipwreck. A broken incense gives off, or broken incense is used in offerings. Broken flowers give off perfume." And so he said, sometimes the only way the good Lord can get into your hearts is to break it. And so that kind of ties into the Flannery thing. Yes. And then, so you kind of think, okay, so you might have that deadened heart, and you might, through the grace of God, need that violent break. And sometimes I'll pray like, okay, Lord, if you need to break my heart, go ahead.
Right.
But maybe you can mold it like the pot, like the clay heart, and just warm it with your love. And anyways, but Pope Benedict, and he's building off of other theologians and philosophers, he also uses the imagery of a wound to talk about beauty. So he says there's this wound of beauty where sometimes you experience something that's beautiful in a way that actually does cause you pain, and you feel this longing to discover the cause of that beauty. So, you would seek out the composer or the artist or whatever, and you further delve into that artist's work or listening to that musician over and over again. And then hopefully it could lead you to the true cause of beauty, God himself. So I liked that image too, where Benedict, and again, he's not alone in saying this, but sometimes the encounter with the beautiful acts as a wound that we then experience in a painful manner, which draws us to the cross, where he says that's beauty, holding himself up there in love amidst all the ugliness of sin and the absolute devastation of the soul's lost, but there's beauty there in the crucifixion, because it's pointing us towards our redemption. So that it's just sort of an interesting blend of beauty. Doesn't just have to be the pleasant sunshine and daisies and lovely, gentle things, but it can be this visceral reaction that gets you to recognize, oh, there's something outside of myself. Like there's something out of my control that's drawing me somewhere else, and I want to follow that. So whether it's, through this pain or through this longing, which I guess you could say too is an element of pain, hopefully it's orienting you outside of yourself towards God.
Great time to end.
Yeah,
I have nothing to add.
Yeah, true.
I'm
Yeah,
not going to try to make that better. So
right. No, truly. I mean, it is just it's a
no, Brian, just just kidding. Good.
God works in a lot
Beautiful
of different ways.
ways.
In beautiful ways. So yeah, that's all.
The Valley of Tears, indeed. Dr. Sullivan, thank you for being on the podcast.
This was awesome.
This
go.
is Doing Virtue.
A Catholic podcast.
a virtue is what we do.
Cheers, everyone.
Thank you.